and put it into practice. And I'll explain this notion by the Dewey's conceptualization of deliberation. So how does deliberation work? And here I'm going to stand up because I want to point a little bit. I hope you can still hear me. So each of the white lines, they represent a possible course of action. So in overt action is what Dewey calls the visual course of conduct. So for example, I'm riding my bike to work. I always use the same path. So this is kind of like automated, and you could see like I'm riding my bike, and then this small circle is supposed to symbolize a conflict. There's a conflict of my prior habit and a new impulse. So I'm like, for example, I hit a construction site and the way is blocked. I can't continue on the path I usually take. So I have to stop and think about the different alternatives. And now each of those white lines, they represent one way I could take. So I'm thinking about, oh, it's one street I could take. Julia knows it's the plug. It's always very crowded. There are pedestrians, cyclists, and cars, and it's always very stressful. So I want to avoid that street. Now I'm thinking of a different route. It doesn't have a bike trail. I would have to ride on the side track. That's not ideal. So I might not want to take that one. I'm looking for a different one. Oh, this one has is a one-way street. I can't go there, or maybe I can because I'm on my bike and it's only a one-way street for cars. So I'm going through all those different options. And Dewey says deliberation comes to a close when we reach a decision. That's the point right there. And how do we do that? He says we kind of fuse the different elements of different options together and merge them onto a path that we can embark upon. And then we kind of jump back into overt action. And the important thing is that Dewey doesn't understand that activity seizes in order to deliberate. Like it's not, we're doing something, activity stops, and then we're thinking about it, and then we continue. But all of this is an activity, and it's just two different modes of activity. But we're acting all the time. It's just a difference if we're acting in execution. This is what he would understand as overt action, or he calls deliberation a rehearsal. So we're kind of going through things, we're deliberating, we're exploring different paths to see where they take us. And what I mean with the dimension of existential interaction, is kind of like where in this process is the focus? Is the focus more on the opening up of options and kind of like going through different ways? Are we rehearsing? Or is the focus more on coming to a conclusion, a decision, and putting it to action? Now, if we focus on the far side, on the implementation side, yes, I was just checking for time. This can be related generally to Dewey's notion or understanding of experience and also the empirical method for philosophy. So, as you all know, Dewey tries to overcome the dualism between practice and theory by integrating experience into a reciprocal relation, where he says all philosophical reflection starts with a problem experience and primary experience. So primary experience is kind of the crude, unmediated experience of the world, and reflective experience for him is kind of like where we're stopping to think and systematically try to analyze a situation to refine our understanding of primary experience. And the way to go about it, he says, is the empirical method for philosophy, where, just like I said, a problem in primary experience sparks philosophical reflection, which aims at finding a solution for this very problem and then translate it back to primary experience in order to lead to some kind of improvement. And the process, the notion of verification is very important in this setting. And what I want to point out about verification are three things. First, he actually gives us a test of how to verify if philosophical reflections are valuable. He says philosophical reflections are valuable if they help to improve our primary experience in some form. And he calls it the use and enjoyment of ordinary things. It is not valuable, on the other hand, if it obscures or degrades primary experience in some sense. So the first question is, does it actually solve something that we're having a problem with? The second thing I want to point out is it's all about deriving an action from the philosophical theory. So it's not just any action. He talks about intelligent action, which is action that is informed by knowledge, guided by knowledge. And the third thing I want to point out is that it's not about finding solutions to universal things or establishing universal theories, but it's always on a case basis. So we're looking at, does this solution we come up with serve a purpose in a specific context with specific people in this setting? So this is the framework. And now I want to get into some examples. So we're starting out in the lower front left corner in the front, yeah. So it's on the social interaction. These are individual approaches. They're interdisciplinary, so they're staying within the field of philosophy, and it's about this deliberation, about this exploration. And this is kind of the section that I understand to be the academic practices of giving talks and writing publications transferred to the public realm. So it could be anything like writing blog posts or op-eds or giving public lectures or such as YouTube videos. In 2014, Ruth Chang gave a TED Talk on how to make hard choices. So it was a individual approach because it was a one-time 50-minute presentation. It's been viewed over 10 million times, so definitely had a large outreach. She stayed within the philosophical field because she used philosophical analysis to point out why hard choices are hard. Turns out they're hard because there's no best option and alternatives are not equally good. And last of all, it's on the scale of existential application. It was really about that rehearsal and thought. So if we come upon a hard decision, what is a tool we could use to address it? But it's not about, I mean, of course, it would be a great outcome if people actually applied it, but the talk is about this exploration of what makes hard choices hard. Then moving one section to the right, the only difference is that now we're talking about collaborative approaches. This could be anything such as philosophical forums, street philosophy, philosophy in prisons, philosophy with children. Maybe you're familiar with ethics bowls in high schools. So these are approaches where it's really about getting a conversation started and getting people to do philosophy in the moment. The focus is still within the discipline of philosophy, so it's still interdisciplinary, and it's really about the exercise of going down those different paths. The first two sections that I just talked about, this is what we usually understand by when we talk about public philosophy. And I think what I want to do with this framework is to show that there are more formats that could be explored. This is not the only way that we could practice public philosophy. So moving one section up, we're now getting into transdisciplinary territory. And an example that I found or that I would place there is last year, I spoke with Joseph Stramondo. He's an associate professor at San Diego State University, and he focuses his research on the intersection of bioethics and philosophy of disability. He is himself a little person who was born to average height parents. And this movie explores, or the documentation explores, the relationship between children and their parents who have a very different identity. And his philosophical reflections on disability and the stigma that is attached to it found an expression in this documentary, which is not a usual format for philosophical work. Moving one section to, I think I turned back. So yeah, one section to the right, left, yeah, I don't. Left. Yes, I have a problem with right and left. These are also individual approaches, transdisciplinary, so they use other forms outside of philosophy. And it's still about this deliberation. And one suggestion I found is that philosophers would be really good at conducting interviews because we're good at asking questions and kind of like challenging preconceived notions. So it would be, there was this one proposition that we should go out and conduct interviews with people of the private sector, of the public sector, could be policymakers, investment bankers, people in the healthcare field. Yeah. I don't have much time left, so I want to get to this section, which in my understanding is the section that Dewey focuses most on. So these are collaborative approaches that go beyond the discipline of philosophy and focus on implementing solutions for problems. This is where I would place field philosophy. I don't have time to go into more detail, but I'm happy to share or talk about it after the presentation. But one specific example of field philosophy that I want to talk about is this. It's called the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative. It was created by Michael O'Rourke, and it aims at improving the work of interdisciplinary groups. The premise is that in interdisciplinary groups, the problem is often that everyone approaches the project from their own framework. They're trained in one discipline that maybe has very different understandings of what good research looks like or how research is conducted. And they're so internalized that we often don't really realize that that's our framework where we're coming from. And this workshop aims at, first of all, bringing to light those core values, those core beliefs about research, seeing where the similarities and where the differences are, and trying to coordinate them for the betterment of the project. Yes. The last one, I'll just talk quickly about it, but this could be something as establishing a nonprofit or becoming engaged in a political party to implement policy changes. And with that, I will close. Thank you so much for your attention.
We'll turn it over to Maura.
Yes. So, okay. So I'm very interested in what you were thinking about, talking about, because I am also, I am a philosophy and education in a philosopher of education. I work in education, but I am also a local administration. So I am the chair and I am the local counselor for education in my town. So one of my of the challenges that I am focusing on is how to engage young people into democratic processes which are connected to the government of our town, and how can we convince people that they can make a difference, in particular young people. We are trying to do different things in my town. We are trying to engage young people. For example, we are starting up different young municipal councils. So each municipality has a council of young people discussing local issues and then bringing the local issues to the general, to the administration. And so these things are connected to my interest in the in democracy, in trying to develop a democratic engagement of young people into society. So connected to my interest is the focus on which are the main issues that we should take into account in order to promote and to implement a different vision of democratic engagement. And my references are John Dewey and Jane Addams for different reasons. One reason is that John Dewey's idea of democracy is an idea of democracy which combines the idea that individual can make a difference within society with his or her own experience, his or her own ideas. And the other idea is that individual and society are to be conceived as an organic combination So individual is organic to society, and society is the place where individuals should grow. And my interest in John Dewey and Jane Addams is also connected to some issues that the two philosophers share, have in common, but also there are some things that are different. For example, Dewey had strong faith on the possibility of developing an industrial democracy, so a democracy within a liberal frame of reference, which Adam did not see. Adam was very worried and aware of the fact that capitalism and the development according to a liberal frame of reference of the economic growth would damage individuals and society. So this element this vision contrasts with Dewey's vision. Dewey's vision led him from one side to see that if we want to bring about the idea of an industrial democracy, so to combine the two issues of democracy and industry, democracy and economical growth, we should rethink in depth the idea of individualism. So he was also rethinking the individualistic frame of reference of liberalism. But this was problematic according to the vision of Jane Addams. So I will focus on some issues that are in common of the two between the two philosophers, and some issues which are different. And the first thing that is in common, they have in common, is that democracy is something that has to do with ethics. It's a moral challenge. So democracy should be understood as an ideal that should lead the actions and the practices of individuals within the associated life. And this would lead Addams, for example, to develop the experience of Hull House, which was also the main reference for John Dewey, because John Dewey thought that Hull House was the living proof that it could be possible to live according to a democratic ideal. And this experience was very intense and very challenging, because showed that it could be possible to break out the differences between different people. So, according to Dewey, the experience of Laos was an experience that showed how it could be possible to contrast and to make people who have different ideas, different experiences of the world, different visions of the world, live together and be together in order to do something that was not solving problems together, but was living together, being together, and experimenting a way of encountering different visions of the world. And this was the main contributor that Jane Addams and the experience of Hull House brought to Dewey's vision of democracy. So not only the possibility to be together, to meet together in order to solve problems together, but to encounter the other. to have a meeting with people who are very, very different and who bring different visions of the world. And these two elements are elements that bring us an understanding of democracy as an ethical ideal and also as a moral challenge. Because from a moral point of view, from a ethical point of view, it is very challenging to meet somebody who has different values, different experiences, different visions of the world, and try to develop something, a new vision of the world, encountering the different ideas, different experiences. And this is connected also with the idea that democracy is according to Adams. She says that it's not she says that democracy is a test of fate. So we should excuse me. We should prove each other every day, every meeting that we have with other people, that we trust in democracy, that we have a faith in democracy, that we believe that we can create something new in different forms of living together, of being together. So this idea of being together, living together, trying to overcome differences and trying to be engaged in a process of growth for each and for everybody is the main challenge of democracy. And this helps Dewey to understand that democracy is the place where a democratic space is the place where individuals can go, can flourish, and can express at the best their own individuality, because there is a democratic environment within which they can grow and can be supported in their growth. The idea of growth is the main idea in Dewey's educational philosophy. Dewey says that growth is not something, is not a point of arrival, but is a center point. So we should support people in growing again and again and again. And a true democratic environment is an environment which supports a continuous growth of individuals. And an environment which supports continuous growth of individuals is an environment which supports also the individual in the understanding that he or she can make a difference. So there should be a strong and aware engagement of each individual on his and her own capacity to make the difference. And this point is connected to another point that I made in my paper, is that in democracy, ethics, science, and the public construction of a public opinion are strongly connected. So Dewey did not see ethics as separated from science, but science was a part of the growth of individual awareness, of the individual capacity to reason, of the individual capacity to be engaged in the social process of growth. And so he saw that science has ethical implications and ethical responsibilities. So science is part of the development of a society. And in these terms, if there is an ethical commitment of science, and if science as is a force which contributes to the growth of society. Science is a driving force for democracy. So if we want to enlarge the capacity to be engaged into democracy, we should also enlarge the capacity to think and to reason according to a scientific method. And so there is a strong connection between science and democracy within Dewey's vision. And another point that I want to make is that according to both to Dewey and to Adams, democracy is to be conceived and as the ethical development of society. So if people are engaged into democratic processes, if people are engaged in the explorations of new possibility to live together, new possibilities to confront different ideas, if they are willing to understand how individuals are organic to society and how society is the living space which supports the individual growth, this is a challenge for both individuals and society. So society has an ethical commitment. Each society, when the society interrogates herself on if it is really democratic. It interrogates herself on her capacity to support individual growth and on her capacity to engage individuals in processes that lead individuals to have an active part in the growth of society. And I want to make a point that Adams makes and that Dewey does not focus on very much because Adams points that the highest ethical ideals, so if we think that the democracy is an ideal and a high education idea, the highest ethical ideas need to be operationalized concretely in everyday experiences and situations, and their operationalization occurs through actions which are, as she writes in 20 Years at Hull House, the only medium man has for receiving and appropriating truth. So every human action contains either the epistemological motive, the search for truth, and an ethical and practical one, the operationalization of ideals and values, and combines both of them completely. So the contributor of Adams, as I believe, is this drive to make the ideal of democracy concrete in everyday experience, in everyday action. And this combination, this focus, also is what I believe is the main point that Adams makes, and is connected to another point that she makes, that is the role of imagination, that imagination plays in the promoting of a democratic asset, a democratic way of life. So if we want to create concrete situations, everyday situations within which democracy is experienced and is implemented, we should also try to make in discussion, criticize our ideal of democracy. So every day we should criticize our idea of democracy. We should not take it for granted, but we should every day discuss it and compare it to what should be a better concrete experience of democracy. So every day criticize it. And this is brought about our capacity to imagine a better society. And this is, I believe, what I think that is the driving force of Adam's idea of democracy, connected to Dewey's idea of democracy as a way of experiencing associate life. And I believe it's the way that we should use to develop challenging educational experiences for our students and our children, but also the adults that live in our society. I want to make only a point that within the European framework, there is a strong movement, a strong call to bring democratic education into educational settings, into our schools, but there is a reference to a curriculum. So we should bring into democracy within the schools through a curriculum of, for example, democratic citizenship. But I don't believe this is a good way to promote education, democratic education. I believe that the better way to promote democratic education is to engage people within true educational experience, true political experience of democratic commitment, and to explore different ways to be together according to a democratic way.
Thank you. All right. Well, I'm just going to first thank the presenters. They're all very enjoyable presentations for me. And I read all the papers this morning, I'll admit. And so what I see as a theme that cuts across these is the question of what can and should we do, what can and does fuel democratic hope in our dark, cynical times, so that democracy doesn't seem to such a quaint and romantic notion, as Kathleen and Dustin said in their paper, quote in their paper. And I can relate to this question about what fuels democratic hope, having written about it before myself during the first, or geez, I can't believe I just said first Trump administration, during the Trump administration. Hence the cynicism coming in. So I can relate to this topic because I actually went back to my own paper that I'd written, which was basically on what habits of hopefulness in democracy. And I talk about hope as a habit and as a way of being, not as a, not as a personal trait or optimism or something like that. And I talked about habits of hope similar to some of the kind of practices they're talking about: storytelling, creativity, mindfulness, community building, and this work connects most directly to Kathleen and Dustin's paper about how do we sustain hope when things seem really hopeful. And I think all of our authors in these three papers struggle with how to maintain in times of increasingly diminished faith in democracy, both on a global scale, but also on a local scale, as Maura was talking about, in terms of getting the local action groups to be doing things in her community. And I thought the papers were ordered well, so kudos to the community. So Kathleen and Dustin give us a very wide view and snapshot of why we need hope, and what are some of the issues that cause a loss of faith in democracy, whereas Leyla gives us a sense of specifically how philosophers might respond to some of these in myriad ways, but that are also connected to our discipline of philosophy that help to diminish hopelessness and existential crises among philosophers about their relevance. And then Maura gives us a rich and ethical, philosophical, practical understanding of democracy that I think undergirds the two other papers' efforts. So hers is more historical and intellectual comparisons, and showing how Adam's work is a good instantiation of Dewey's ideas in practice. And so what I'm just going to briefly do in about 2 minutes is give one key thing that stuck out to me to each paper and one question for each of the authors, but I'm not going to ask them to answer the question, just to throw it out there, and then we're going to use your questions. But to start with Kathleen and Dustin's, I love the way they talk about cynicism in nuanced ways. We tend to think about it as always bad, and I think discussing the importance of cynicism as a philosophical and intellectual tradition, which might be better worded as critique than cynicism, but it's not just an attitude or something, but it's a useful complement to action. We have to like question the things that we're doing. I also appreciate their move to Melvin Rogers, and I've written about his work before, and his finding the resources for fueling hope. And what I think they do so well is connect it with some current contemporary Black pragmatist philosophers quite well. I wonder, though, the example that Kathleen only touched about at the end, this played out more in the paper, an example of states mandating marginalized stories be included as part of the curriculum as a hopeful move. I was a little I got the sense that it was actually just like the reverse side of the coin of critical race theorists banning them. I think mandating and banning have the same sort of sweeping, non-democratic dimensions to them. Even though I like what they're calling for, I think that example might be too black and white or reductive. But I also like their notion of critical responsiveness. And so for Leyla's paper, I really love how she unpacks what philosophers do and could potentially do, especially in terms of public philosophy. She does a great job in the paper about the pragmatist notion of imagination, which she only touched on here, that I thought was really good, and its possibilities for more engaged philosophy. I wasn't familiar with the piece that she mentioned by Pleasance and Eliot that she builds on, but a Dewey-inspired edition of the existential application of these ideas and she's adding it to, they talked about social integration and epistemic integration, and adding that to public philosophy I thought was really compelling. And I already asked Leyla this earlier, but after engaging the paper this morning, I was like, it's clearly to me that she comes out of a philosophy department or a philosophy tradition, not as a philosophy of ed tradition, because philosophers of education, even though we engage that question of dilemmas of relevance similarly, we're always forced by our colleagues in School of Education to prove our worth and prove our relevance. And so in the more tradition of philosophy of education, philosophers might be worried about this right now, but we're worried about relevance all the time. And I also think, I wonder, she says in there, can we imagine both practical and more abstract philosophy? She's not trying to have us get away from traditional forms of philosophizing, but just complementing them with more practical forms. And I wonder if there's a way we could ever imagine them not being hierarchical, right? And this is a debate that we're having all the time in schools. Anything practical seems less scholarly, right? Except there's different levels of institutions. That's mostly true at the top tier, division, I was going to say Division I in sports metaphors, but like the Harvards and the Ivy Leagues, and then the flagship universities, where that's where like you publish or perish. You have to keep publishing and publishing and publishing. You can't publish practical work in the same ways. It doesn't count in the same ways. And so I'm just not sure whether this call for practical philosophy might not fit in with other problematic calls happening around the world for like more vocational education. So let's get rid of the philosophy departments and keep some sort of engaged philosopher, and then we won't need philosophy departments anymore. And in my university, we have just gotten rid of a bunch of programs, including anthropology, physics, religion, humanities departments. They're all being cut. And yet we've added programs and things like, and it's a big university, 20,000 students, that I don't even know what are: information analytics, esports. Like there's no humanities anymore. And so I wonder how the call for a push for a practical philosophy could inadvertently contribute to a call for getting rid of the humanities. And finally, from Maura, I think she does a really nice job of reviewing the ethical and practical dimensions of democracy as articulated by Dewey and Adams, and showing Hull House as an embodiment of some important democratic ideals. She offers a compelling definition of democracy as a moral challenge, an ethical reference, and a political goal. The one question I had when reading hers was the larger context for the paper. She opens in the written paper, but that is part of a collective project on democratic education. So I understood the paper to be more sort of doing a historical intellectual comparison in an in-depth way. But I wondered what was the context that led to that interest now. A lot of scholars have connected Dewey and Hull House. And so is there some other question besides filling out this connection as part of a larger project on democratic approaches to education. So like, that gets like, you know, the why this, why now, because other people are doing this as well. And one of the answers to why this, why now might be just the simple problem we've been talking about is you're forced to publish all the time. And so you have to keep writing about anything as opposed to writing when it's meaningful, because that's the neoliberal academic society. So, all right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow the discussion guidelines that were presented to us, which is stopping into my questions and allowing you guys all to talk. Troubles with language. Don't say you guys, don't say you men and women, you people, you gang, the team view in here, to talk for about 3 or 4 minutes. So everybody has a chance to think about their question and think about whether they really want to ask their question, or it might just be a conversation. And then we'll still have a great deal of time before we will, for a conversation. So we'll give it 4 minutes, all right? So everybody talk a little bit. And if you need to run to the bathroom or leave, you can apparently do that too. All right, I think we're ready to pull it back together and engage in some questions. So this hopefully gave you an opportunity to try out your question and see if it was smart or not. All right, who would like to get us started with the more general discussion? And we have a good half an hour still, a little more than a half an hour. Yes, sure. Julian, right?
Okay, so I have a question for every one of our speakers. I'd like to make it find what we have to cynicism, but also what a Dewey interpretation still can do today. And maybe part of this cynicism from actually the withdrawal and the escape, maybe also from the public sphere of so many people, and especially people in my generation. So that's maybe where educators should attack, if I may say so, and of course the youngest, to actually sensitize them again for their individual purpose. And I mean, there is so many reasons for cynicism. For example, when you look at the climate crisis, and that maybe the generations to come will be the last generations to witness what we and the ones before us did wrong and so on. But where can you then really see the points where you can engage them actually with alerting people for their purpose and also the individual responsibility that they have? Yes. Because a part of this project of explorational democracy, and I think even more in Adams than in Dewey, is hope. That you actually have got reasons to vote for something. But in my generation, mine is the first that is in fact in decline and deterioration in our perspectives, at least about the future. And how can you, so to speak, reinvigorate hope in this project without being, I don't know, unrealistic? Because realism is good, but you have to have some notion of hope in this aspirational democracy thinking heights. And oh, that's good. And so then I'm carrying on with the microphone. And my other question then is for Leyla. That is really about what you explained about this project of public philosophy. If there is one project, certainly a plurality of different projects. My question is, because you spoke about that, of course, we can turn into politics. And of course, in reproducing this old dilemma, should the philosopher be kings? And what can then really philosophers do to essentially, on the one hand, be effective in the public sphere and maybe also shaping public opinion without being, on the other hand, too paternalistic? So in the way, oh, we know better what to do, and others should follow along, and so on and so forth. So how do we not reproduce these errors of classical politics, that we reproduce the divide between the governed and the people who actually do govern? And how can we then actually live up to the promise that each citizen's voice is equally worth, and that, of course, all of these voices should also be active, and not only in theory, but in practice, without, on the other hand, then reproducing these dilemmata that come with, of course, classical politics, that it's always about power to a certain extent, and unfortunately also manipulation. So how can you avoid that? Being actually more Socratic in the sense that you're the annoying, so to speak, gadfly that shows where the problems are, but leave the work to the citizens without telling them we know better. Okay, thank you.
All right, I think since you have so many complex questions there, I will ask the panelists, whoever feels the most moved to answer one of those questions, to try and do it quickly, but I think it would take all of our time for them to answer all of your questions. And so, or maybe just very brief responses.
I will say, what I understood your question to be is, how do we think about democratic hope, particularly for your generation? I feel like we briefly visit Sarah Stitzlin's Learning How to Hope in the book and in the paper, and talk about how we think that democratic faith is a precondition of hope. And I think Dewey's democratic faith is one of really understanding that democracy isn't government, and democracy. So having a proper understanding about what democracy isn't. When I say faith in democracy, a lot of my students think I'm saying you should have faith in the government, right? And so relearning what democracy is, which of course speaks to social studies and history curriculum, I think, and also learning critical media habit. I think critical media is so powerful for thinking about how the media helps drive the cynicism and the ignorance about democracy as well. And so I think both looking at history and social studies and critical media teaching is very central to figuring out what a right democratic faith is and how to creatively engage with it. But that's the best I can do with that great question. Thank you.
All right, Leyla, go ahead.
Yes, I want to point out that, okay, I would not speak about hope. I would speak about responsibility. I would speak about the need to be part of a process of change, of innovation, of the capacity to imagine and to develop a project for a new society. So it's not hope. In order to be, you spoke about realism. We should be realistic. Okay, and being realistic seems to means to focus on what I can do now in order to bring about change. What are what is the space of my action? Is there a space for my action? Is there a place for my imagination and for my ideas to be I spoke of operationalization, to be applied, to be put in practice? So this, I believe, is the educational challenge that we have, because people don't find this space, for the place for them.
I'll just respond very quickly because we're at the same university, so we can go into more detail at another time. But the thing is really about, so the expert model is saying that a university is a framework where knowledge is created, and because of this, this is like a place of superiority of knowledge. Public philosophy or engaged philosophy tries to turn away from that expert model, saying like only academics are in a place to create knowledge, but rather seeing people or participants of these engaged approaches really as equal partners in a co-creation process of knowledge, and trying to engage with them not in an attitude of trying to teach something to them or being above them, but being equal partners in a shared process.
Just to piggyback off of that as a
Co-author, go ahead.
Co-author is just the act, I mean, what makes democratic faith a radical act or critical in that context is that you don't have the evidence yet that you do with hope, right? So as a precursor, it comes before that, and to see it and have a vision of democracy without already having concrete evidence, that's pretty radical.
Cool. I'm gonna go over here, right here, and then in the back.
We were talking about Jane Addams and Dewey addressing your last question as a discussant, and I heard, and I just wonder if I was hearing correctly, that there might have been a different emphasis in Addams, where you're talking about the idea of coming together with a certain quality of inquiry, collaborative relation in the interest of bettering something, in the interest with an end in view, but that Dewey was about end in views. The emphasis was on doing. And I heard maybe in what you were saying about Addams that maybe there was a deeper emphasis on being in relation, and it addresses the whole question of hope and faith, because to the extent that we're focusing on being in a certain quality of relation, this is something we can do. This is, as you say, this is within our sphere of influence. And so the idea of the work providing meaning for a life, you know, it doesn't have to have, you know, I mean, so anyway, it feels more relational, what you were saying about Addams. And I was just wondering if that was right.
Yes, it is more relational, but it is also connected to the fact that, and Dewey acknowledged this, Adam was very much worried of removing barriers, removing social barriers, and working towards a different way of being together within social environment. So yes, it's a way of being together. It's a way of understanding each other. It's a way not being together, trying to solve together problems, no? Which is a more doing idea. But the before being together and trying to solve social problems together, we should understand each other. We should communicate to each other. So this is the precondition of working together, according to a democratic vision. So yes, I was focusing on the real and concrete experience of living together and also overcoming differences.
All the way in the back. Did you have a question? Yeah. And then I'll get to you, Kurt.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank you all three speakers. You've managed to really create a nice shared conversational space. Thank you very much for that. And I would like to formulate a shared comment for all of you. I think that this political cynicism or skepticism is fueled sometimes also unconsciously and unintentionally by political actions or politicians' actions, or rather inability to action, inability to respond properly to our environmental and climate crises. And this is the reason, or one of the, I think, most important reasons for which there are some assumptions, some suggestions that maybe democracy is not a proper regime, or a regime which is unable to cope with climate crisis, and maybe we should suspend democracy for some time, just to save the planet, save the future of our children and grandchildren. And the response from democratic side to those suggestions from democratic defenders are, suggestions that we should start to use, or we should apply some deliberative democratic tools. One of them are, for example, deliberative mini publics, which have been used at least in Europe, and at least with some partly success. And my question to all of you is, do you think that this deliberative way, sharing this idea of the deliberative democracy, is it a good way to regain the faith into democracy, regain the hope, and also to change political practice and to save the planet and save the future? Thank you for that.
Someone want to take? Go ahead, Leyla. All right, Kathleen. Leyla?
I mean,
Layla's jumping.
Yeah. What came up to my mind, well, to me, the question, of course, I think it's a good way. For me, I think the thing is, how do we get people to actually do it? How do we get people to engage in these processes? Because they do exist, but for example, the problem with philosophical forums, why they're not having this kind of big impact on society, is that they're attended on a voluntary basis, and it's usually the people who are already kind of behind democratic principles or ideals who attend them. But I think one example that came to my mind as you were speaking is there's this project called My Country Talks. It's been happening in the UK, in Germany, all over Europe. It's about getting two people with opposing political views to get to have a conversation together. And it has been shown that in this one-on-one context, it is possible to establish a common ground. It is possible to stop shouting at one another and kind of trying to understand where the other person is coming from, even if we totally disagree with their position, and even if we find it unsustainable. But I think this is one way of trying to get people to use these deliberative tools to regain faith in cohesion as a society and in working together towards maintaining our democracy.
It just made me think for 1 second, though, like that example that you give is also an example in the US. except it's an example of an advertisement for a beer commercial, right? Selling beer. Look, these people who have different views can sit down next to each other and share a glass of beer. And then, so anyway.
Now, I want to point out that if you focus on real problems, I mean, problems that affect your life, your daily experience, and then from different points of view, you can come to deliberate a solution that can be a good solution for both parts. But the problem should be real, concrete, and and then you should, after you have made a decision, you should fastly try to practice, put it in practice. Otherwise, people are, dissatisfied, and they believe everything is just, a fake, is not real.
I have a response too. I think we were in a session before this one where Joshua, whose name escapes me, but wrote this really nice paper engaging Aaron Schutz's work around Dewey's overemphasis on deliberation. I'm not sure if you were in that session, but Aaron's work has convinced me that Deweyan overemphasis on deliberation needs a revision, a reconceptualization. And so deliberation and agonism are both necessary for the democratic project. And in the case of climate change, it's likely that government is so ineffective and ossified around, oil dependency and bad climate stuff that it needs the push of agonism, it needs the push of agonism for better deliberation. And so revising an understanding of democracy as both deliberative and activist and resistant, which is hard to ask of public school systems, frankly, in most parts of the world. But I feel like that's a really important piece of balancing democracy's promise, is teaching all of those skills and thinking about where kids can learn that continuum of skills of democratic engagement, if that makes sense.
Great answer. Kurt.
Thank you. So I'm about all this, and in the US, it feels to me like we're at a point where we can't really sit across the table with somebody with political differences and come to understand each other very well. And that's why, like when you were saying about Jane Addams and focusing on like encountering the other, that I was thinking the kind of active part of Dewey, where it's like, no, instead of just encountering the other, you do stuff together. It's kind of the Deweyan way. That if there's hope in the US context, at least, it feels like maybe trying to think about how it is that we can get people together across lines of difference, but to do things that don't relate to their difference. Because as a starting point, like, as we've been, for a lot of reasons, we've been divided, and I think, our differences have been cynically exploited by people, and people don't even want to understand each other across difference. But if you can go and if you can find common projects to work on, or whatever it is, get people in spaces together, doing things together, then there's potential for that. This is the way that I see it.
Thank you, Robert Talisse. That comes right out of Robert Talisse's book, Overdoing Democracy. But I think we're running a little low on time, because I realize there's no break built in between now and the Dewey lecture. So I think what I'll have everybody do is just, those of you who still have questions, ask them succinctly, but we'll just go, they're not going to have time to answer them. That way we have a few-minute break between the auditorium. So if you want to ask them so that they know what people are asking about, Len, and if you want to just take that mic.
Dustin's point, but I think what's really missing is a goal culture that actually isn't tremendously. Look, and Jane had the integration of all these immigrants in a vibrant, multicultural society, right? A civil rights movement in the 50s, vibrant, multiracial democracy, right? 80s, vibrant, new, the earth, eco, whatever, and what's happened, I think, is these things have been so crushed. I was also going to say in the 70s, we had the sexual revolution and the hope for great expressive society. I don't think there's anything quite like that right now. There's so I think that one thing philosophers can do and it's just a question for all of us, is how do we create, how do we invent a great vision that people can have some faith in actually devoting themselves to, because they really devoted themselves to all these other things that I mentioned.
Anybody else wants to get a question in or comment? Everybody wants a break, I gather. So let's take that break and thank this for lovely presenters. Yeah, I thought we had till like 5:45, and then I was like, wait, there's no, that would mean that they don't have time to set up and everything. So are you?
To engage young people, because my town is divided into a big town.
Okay.
It's the third town in Italy. I am in the south. It's
Yes,
the
yes.
Third town.
Yes, yes.
After Rome and Milan.
Uh-huh.
And so we are divided into 10 municipalities.
Okay.
And we are developing local municipal councils, young councils.
That's wonderful.
Engaging the schools. So the kids come from the schools, they vote.
Nice.
So children from all the schools of the area. Okay?
Uh-huh.
And they meet every, within the local municipality halls, and they bring their ideas, they denounce, for example, programs and so on.
Uh-huh.
And then we meet some other people from the council goes to meet them.
Oh, I love that. So you're like on the municipal council and you meet with the student councils.
Yes.
Okay.
Then municipal council, and I meet the local municipal councils.
See, I'm convinced that local work is part of the key to healing democratic faith and like getting people engaged in a problem they care about locally with other people. Like and I don't want to emphasize local too hard because that sort of negates the power of virtual. But I think local is where we begin with nurturing democratic faith.
Focusing on community.
Yeah, right, exactly.
So the idea is to develop a democratic community, and if you develop a democratic community, then you can develop a democratic society.
Yeah. Len, how are you? That's good.
You folks will have it.
They don't have the science. Let's start out. I mean, I'm always careful about.
You a big part of your session was live stream. Working on, that's where I working on the live streaming, and you were online today. I hope you said something very good. Heard you online? Yes. Yes. We were working on getting this for. Twice they got it set up. So they let it go.
So I think it's all of it, yes.
I don't know if everybody's watching, but I'm on. Oh, really?
Wherever's comfortable for you. I mean, you're
No, that's right. That's right. And that's the whole time. Most.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, great.
So. But it puts pressure on the direction of the event. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, that's what I appreciate. You know, hanging at it. I know. Well, there are other ways. Yeah, where it's just like right now.
It wasn't.
Oh, yeah, it probably is.
Yeah. But you have already. We said that. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I don't even need to see presentation. Yeah. Yeah, and then I did and for.
On?
What I would think if I was sick and on a breaks Sunday. First time I thought I'm not sure. I've been posted it's a month. In Portugal. No. Just take it on. Everybody take their dad. We have time. But it's a, I've known about it. Wrong since I was here. And honestly, so that's. I need to run around the corner. Continue the conversation. Yeah. Figure something out.
Receipt of something. Yes. Show. So I have, why give you, or to be an invoice and I'll give you. Yes, yes.
And I mean, I guess we can also.
Okay, yes, yes, that's how we do it. Yes. Invoice, yes.
Except for things that are.
Yes, I think we're doing very well. Yeah.
Prevailed what they were downloaded or was there available? I think it's you're not right there.
I don't believe those words have ever come out. The nice paper last time, so I did. Back here. Roads and problems. Do we need to use? I knew you were gonna say.
Yeah, there are many people that things that are.
Well, I was told I had to grant it to the house, but as another business. Nice to see you. How are things going?
I got it from the last one there. Yes, indeed.
So, are you doing well?
But for example, I would rather find a model because the landscape Yes.
Can we hear me? Yes, hello? Ladies and gentlemen, friends, Romans, countrymen. Yeah, we're going to have somebody whistle at you. Few more people still coming in. We're going to pretend we're not in Portugal and we're going to move on time, sort of. I didn't mean that. No, I've actually not noticed that here, that people are late, that things happen late. Okay. Before I introduce our John Dewey Memorial Lecturer, I want to invite a longtime friend of mine, Professora Anna Artur, to say hello. Anna is currently the president of MEM Evora, Movement of Modern Schools, Movimento de Escola Modernas, and the John Dewey Society every year at our, welcome and stop laughing, Michelle. Every year at our conference, we make a donation to a local educational group. And this year we have chosen to make a donation to MEM Evora to support their work in developing democratic experiences in very young children, which I think is a very important place to go. So Anna, if you can just explain a little bit about MEM.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank the John Dewey Society for their kind donation to every regional nucleus of MEM. And my special thanks to Barbara, our friend, I can say, for her commitment to the promotion of this initiative. I'm speaking in the name of my colleagues of the Núcleo Evora of MEM, but also as a president of the association. The Modern School Movement, MEM, as we know, is a Portuguese association of education professionals based on democratic project of cooperative self-training. It's also characterized by a social movement for human development and pedagogical change. The Evora Nucleus is part of a group of 16 others spread across Portugal. Every month, the Evora Nucleus has an activity open to the community called Pedagogical Saturday. It includes reports on practices of teachers from different levels of education, from early childhood to higher education. This activity is part of the ethical and social commitment of the members to share what they learn at MEM. So our activities in pedagogy are based on the democratic principles of education. One of the aims of the pedagogical model is precisely initiation into democratic practices. We consider that pedagogical means must express the democratic aims of education. From MEM's perspective, learning contexts must be connected with life, and the opportunity to learn must be experienced in the authentic cultural contexts. We defend the democratic direct participation of the children. In our groups, no one represents everyone, but everyone represents themselves, and every child has the opportunity to have their voice listening. Decisions of the group are made by negotiation and consensus, where communication and dialogical interaction are fundamental. Children participate in planning and evaluation, and they engage in self-initiated projects with their peers and the teachers in a community of practice. That's why we assume that democracy is not learned through lessons, but living it from early childhood education. As a member of MEM, a colleague of us says, educating for citizenship in a democratic context implies first and foremost that we become better Democrats and better citizens. I would like to now to invite you to participate on the 45th MEM Congress that will happen in July on the 18th, 19 and 20 of July in Lisbon at the Institute of Education. We'll send the formal invitation to Barbara, and I want only to thank you once again for your kindness and for recognizing MEM as an association that fights every day for the quality of democracy and in schools and in the society. Thank you.
It's my pleasure. I want to thank you. If anybody has any questions about MEM and their work, Anna is here, as is her associate, Asuncion Falk. And they have both been involved in this works for as long as I've known them since 2008, and they'd be happy to tell you more about it. If you would like to support this work in some small monetary way, please go to the John Dewey Society website. And you have to go click on jds.johndeweysociety.org, click on Conference 2024 registration, and scroll down to the line that says Support Democratic Education in Portugal. We'll take any small or large donations. The other point that I want to make is that most of you are registered for the conference, but if you are not, would you please see me, particularly if you're going to be eating and drinking with us. Now, it's my extreme pleasure to introduce our John Dewey Society Memorial Lecture, and I should be making it all about Carolyn Pedwell, but of course I'm going to make it all about me. I have had an interest in affect theory for a number of years, in addition to an interest in new materialism and some other critical theories of various kinds. And I have been particularly interested in the work of Lauren Berlant and Sarah Ahmed and some other people. And at some point, I came across a book by Carolyn Pedwell called Revolutionary Routines. And you will be hearing something about that book. Some of that content. But I also realized that we have a very good friend in common, someone who had been a colleague of mine for 25 years in Pennsylvania. And I was completely taken with the book. Sarah Stitzline, I think, shared my perception of it. And so I decided to invite Carolyn because I wanted to meet her. And I'm happy to say that I was right. I did want to meet her. We had dinner last night with Andrea and found lots of common ground and lots of interesting ideas. And so I'm very happy to be here to say just a little bit about her, but you can, you know, investigate and interrogate her later. Carolyn is a professor in digital media in the sociology department of, and this is hard for me, Lancaster University in the UK. And the reason it's hard for me is that I live in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and you don't say Lancaster, you say Lancaster. She's the author of a bunch of books. Ask her about them. She has just changed jobs within last month. Like, she's in the middle of changing jobs. She was a professor of cultural studies and media at the University of Kent. She had previously been at Newcastle and at Goldsmiths, and holds a PhD in gender studies from University College London. I think I got that right. I'm quite impressed that she has just received a British Academy mid-career fellowship. So and we can all appreciate this, moving from one job to another, she gets there with lots of time and support to do the kind of research that she wants to. And you probably won't hear too much about it, but the fellowship, well, the topic is digital media and the human, no, that's the old one. What's the one now?
Speculative machines and us, AI intuition and the making of computational cultures.
Yes, a lot about intuition, very interesting stuff. So anyway, we're going to be hearing more about revolutionary routines, the habits of social transformation. What drew me to the book initially was the very interesting way that Carolyn employed John Dewey's theory of habit. So please welcome Carolyn Pedwell.
Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. Thank you to our hosts, to the conference organizers for curating such a fantastic event in such a stunning location. And personal thanks again to Barbara and to Andrea for inviting me to be here and for welcoming me so warmly. Usually when I present my work, it's to people that don't know much of anything about Dewey. So we are definitely turning the tables here today, and I've already learned a great deal from the really interesting panels that I've attended already today. So as you know, the guiding question that's animating our event we're gathered for here is or how is Deweyan pragmatism critical? And I'm actually really excited to have the opportunity to speak to this question today because it's a question that has motivated and inspired my own thinking and grappling and researching for many years now. And that's been particularly in relationship to a project I've been working on that had a hunch that thinking further about the logics and dynamics of habit might help us to arrive at a different understanding of social change than we tend to get in dominant or traditional understandings. And I know that a lot of you have also been thinking with Dewey on habit and transformation in different ways. So this project culminated in the book that Barbara mentioned called Revolutionary Routines, which was thinking about the relationships between habit, affect, and social transformation in the context of shifting geopolitical relations, new forms of digital technology, and networked forms of activism, among other social and political dynamics. I think that my scholarly route to becoming interested in how habit might be part of social transformation came from a previous book project. And this was a book that I worked on about the politics of empathy. And one of the things that really struck me by the time I kind of finished writing that book is how much of the work on empathy across a range of fields seems to be invested in the transformational promise of a kind of affective revolution, whether at the level of the embodied subject or the social collective. So whether in the field of international development or electoral politics or particular strands of feminist or anti-racist praxis, there's this idea of the promise of empathy. So this is an idea or perhaps a fantasy that if people could just be affected powerfully enough through, for example, being exposed to others' suffering and perhaps their own complicity in the wider relationships of power that sustained that suffering or violence or oppression, then they might be radically moved. And in doing so, they might be compelled to really substantially change their ways of seeing, being, and acting in the world, in the interest of greater social justice, however that might be defined in a given set of conditions. Now, this narrative is really seductive, and I think it's ubiquitous, but what became really troubling to me about it by the end of this research on empathy is that people who are invested in it rarely address the question of what happens after empathy in any serious or sustained way. But also, and I think importantly for my project about habit, they also often fail to engage fully with the sedimented, although not necessarily conscious or easily discernible embodied, affective, and material patterns and habits that function to keep existing modes of being, seeing, feeling, and acting in place. Not to mention the wider geopolitics and biopolitics that invocations for more empathy as some sort of effective solution are often bound up with. So my next step was to think more about habit. And it was through my encounters in particular with the classical American pragmatism of William James and John Dewey, as well as the earlier writing of the French philosopher and archaeologist Félix Ravissant, that I pretty quickly realized that habit was vital not only to getting a better understanding of why things so often stay the same or get worse despite our best efforts, but also to how real, progressive, and durable transformation might take shape at the current socio-political conjuncture. And it's probably worth mentioning that I was really starting to think about this more and writing some of the early chapters from the Habit book in around 2016. And in retrospect, this seems like a historic year because, of course, it was the year that Donald Trump was elected to the American presidency. But also on the other side of the Atlantic in the UK, where I live and work, it was the year of the historic Brexit vote to leave the European Union. So for me and many of my friends and colleagues situated variously on the political left, this is a real time of like, what just happened? Like, how did we get here and where do we go next? It was a time characterized by rising populisms of the left and right, the radical reconfiguration of major geopolitical alliances and communities, a harrowing international refugee crisis, looming global climate catastrophe, the ambivalent promises of new digital technologies, and resurgent misogynist, homophobic, racist, xenophobic, and anti-trans ideologies. So kind of wrapped up together in a bundle, all of this just really felt like this concept of progress, which of course we'd already critiqued from all sorts of different directions, but nonetheless had some remaining investment in, was perhaps beyond resuscitation. What happens to the concept of progress or progressive politics, in these dark times? So that was kind of the context in which I began thinking about habit from a philosophical or critical theory perspective. But from a more personal perspective, I think my interest in the relationship between habit and different forms of change goes back earlier than this. And it goes back to around 2008. Because in 2008, somewhere that year, I stopped sleeping. Now, this was a year of quite significant change in my own life. The previous year, I'd finished my doctorate, I'd ended a long-term relationship, and I was about to start a new job in a distant city. So lying in bed night after night, not being able to sleep, in a state of increasing anxiety and exhaustion, I became aware of the disruption of a habit that I hadn't recognized before as even being a habit. That is the habit of sleeping through the night effortlessly and not having to think about it. This went on kind of on and off for a number of years. And over time, I became reliant on various props, routines, and pharmaceutical aids to manage my insomnia. And I kind of madly sought relief in everything from meditation and acupuncture to cognitive behavioral therapy and psychotherapy. And it just felt like nothing really worked. Like the harder that I tried to dislodge my insomniac habit, the more powerful and resistant it became. Well, then came 2016, this year that it seemed like all this stuff was happening. For me, I attended a sleep school in London. Now, this wasn't a sleep school where they hook up different wires to you and measure, physiological processes. It was something different. The instructor had completed a doctorate in cognitive behavioral therapy-based approaches to insomnia, but he'd been convinced through his own practice that such techniques, in their tendency to focus too much attention on the behavior that you wanted to change, actually were not particularly effective. And in fact, they could be counterproductive. And this was a conclusion I'd come to myself over the years. Instead, he offered an approach that combined mindfulness and acceptance-based tools. So our assignment in the sleep school was to gradually give up on the various props that we depended on to manage our sleeplessness. And if we were struggling, which we were, to focus on the sensation of being awake. Now, by this point, I had become well acquainted with classical philosophies of habit, and I recognized how this sleep school approach resonated with Dewey and pragmatism. The sleep school was really about the only way to release yourself from habitual insomnia was to stop trying to sleep, to stop thinking about it at all, if you could. Now, as many of you will know, Dewey has this great example in Human Nature and Conduct, where he talks about the futility of repeatedly telling somebody with a problem with their posture to stand up straight. The assumption that verbal instruction is all that required implies, as he puts it, that the failure to stand erect is wholly a matter of failure of purpose and desire. Yet a man who does not stand properly forms a habit of standing improperly, a positive, forceful habit. Conditions have been formed for producing the bad result, and the bad result will occur as long as those conditions exist. And more to this, and this is the point that I really found powerful for my own project, Dewey argues that if affirmative transformation is the goal, then compelling people to focus on what is wrong, on what they should not be doing, could be the worst possible approach because it maintains attention on the bad result rather than on a potentially generative change in the making. So in relation to this example, Dewey says, we must stop even thinking about standing up straight. To think of it is fatal, for it commits us to the operation of an established habit of standing wrong. We must find an act within our power which is disconnected from any thought about standing. We must start to do another thing, which on one side inhibits our falling into the customary bad position, and on the other side is the beginning of a series of acts which might lead to the correct posture. Now, one of the things that was also really interesting to me at this time was how Deweyan pragmatism and how he was thinking about habit and social change really resonated with some of the affect theory and work in affect studies that I was also immersed in at the time. And I'm thinking particularly about the late queer scholar and literary theorist Eve Sedgwick and her book Touching Feeling, which is a key text in contemporary affect studies and was published in 2003. And in this book, she says something quite similar to Dewey. She says that repeated acts of exposing the bad and mimetically tracing its contours often work precisely to reproduce its force. Now, what Sedgwick is talking about here is how we tend to understand and practice critique in various broadly left-leaning kind of critical fields, whether in social cultural theory or literary studies or various kinds of philosophy. For Sedgwick, we often see critique as a repeated practice of exposing problems, of exposing the bad. So in a particular text or practice, looking for where there's hidden essentialism or something that at first glance looks progressive or radical, but if you deconstruct it, is actually perpetuating normativity. And she says that this idea of critique, or what it means to be critical, actually assumes that we always already know in advance what epistemic or material practices are likely to produce social justice and which aren't. And so the work of social transformation is to point out when the bad stuff is happening, and expose it. But like Dewey, Sedgwick argues that this idea of what it means to be critical actually prevents us from ever being able to inhabit change as it unfolds, to actually be kind of in the flow of transformation when it's happening. That is, it closes down more experimental, speculative, and process-oriented approaches to personal and social transformation. So when I'm thinking about this question, how is Deweyan pragmatism critical? I think I've also been thinking about what does Dewey and what does contemporary affect theory get us to think about in terms of the term critical itself. What might it mean to be critical in our current socio-political conditions, and how might that be a bit different from the way many of us have been trained? So going back to my insomnia, it turned out, I mean, a lot of other things happened between 2008 and 2016, but actually giving up on trying to sleep once I was finally able to do that and focusing on the sensation of being awake eventually worked. And by the summer of 2017, I just had this sense that something had shifted. I finally believed that I could sleep again. And barring an off night here or there, the insomnia that had plagued me for so many years has not since returned. So I'm mentioning this anecdote to you here today, not only because I think my experience of habitual sleeplessness might resonate with some of you, especially when you're at a conference, hotel room, that can be a non-sleeping event, but also maybe more crucially, because it fundamentally changed the way I thought about change. And change was really, the key topic of the book I wrote about habit. And in that book, I framed it in terms of this idea of what it might mean, or what might be opened up if we think about change in a minor key. The philosopher Erin Manning, in her excellent book called The Minor Gesture, published in 2016, says that actually we often understand change in a major key. We understand transformation as unfolding via significant events, turning point moments, and revolutionary upheaval. But as both the visceral experience of insomnia and potentially recovering from it, as well as various philosophies of habit and affect suggest, it's often the less perceptible, more processual and minor dynamics of habit that are vital to transformation. It's probably worth saying here that for Manning, and the same for myself, the minor is not simply what is insignificant or happening at a micro level, and it's not necessarily associated with any figure of the marginal, although it might be all of those. But I think what's most important for Manning, following Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, is that the minor names those continually unfolding, yet often unrecognized dynamics that, in her words, open up everyday experience to its potential variation. I think that's a really key point. Like, how can we open up existing experience in the present, as Dewey thinks about, to other types of materializations and possibilities? So in interpreting social change in a minor key in my work, I've tried to explore how everyday habits constitute crucial sites of transformation, but ones that might be overlooked or disregarded if we focus on major chords alone. As part of this project, I've also been interested in thinking about or perhaps rethinking the relationships between affect and habit. And I know many of you have been doing this in different ways too. Now, in my field of affect studies, this term affect has been subject to these oddly heated and kind of contested debates about how it can be defined. Is it radically different from emotion and feeling, or is it overlapping? And at this point, I'm just, I don't think those debates are getting us anywhere good. And I found it most useful in this project to understand affect quite broadly here as unfolding intensities that animate the flows, tensions, and possibilities of everyday life. So if some literature is associated with the so-called turn to affect, like the empathy literatures that I've started with, focus on the transformative power of affective upheavals, breaks, and revolutions, I've been much more interested in the nature and implications and possibilities of affective patterns, tendencies, and modes of inhabitation. But let's also think a little bit more about the term habit. Habit, as you will know, has a long history in philosophy. So Aristotle uses the concept to think about the persistence of actions that are sometimes active, sometimes dormant. In the book, I do a kind of partial genealogy about this, but we don't have time. So skipping forward several centuries, Dewey talks about habit in quite rich and multi-layered ways, but probably the most succinct way to summarize his account of habit is to say that it's an acquired predisposition to particular modes of responsivity and action. And I'll try to build on that a little bit more as I go on. Interesting reading for me was Catherine Malabou's preface to the first English translation of the French philosopher Félix Rabisson's book of Habit. The book was first published in 1838, but it was only translated into English in 2008. And one of the arguments she makes here is that although there's this long and complicated genealogy of habit, in the 21st century, it seems that we've become habituated to kind of one dominant understanding of habit. And this is habit as kind of mindless repetition that keeps everything the same, and therefore is kind of antithetical to critical thinking, to wonder, and to transformation. But Malibu argues that, of course, there is this other genealogy that starts with Aristotle, that moves through Hegel and is resonant with the recent philosophies of Henri Bergson and Gilles Deleuze, and I would argue also kind of Deweyan pragmatism, which conceptualizes habit as the essence of being and becoming. And actually, Malibu's argument is that Ravison looks at how, those two understandings of habit are always intertwined. Like that's what makes up the concept of habit, that habit is both about automated repetition and being and becoming, and those processes are working in tandem. And that's perhaps why it is a rich and multifaceted concept to think about transformation through. So this has been important to my work on habit and transformation. Habit, I suggest, attunes us simultaneously to, on the one hand, the powerful automated processes and mechanisms underlying the tendency for patterns of oppression and inequality to persist. And on the other hand, the necessary but maybe counterintuitive role of habituation in enabling meaningful and enduring forms of social political transformation. So to provide a couple examples of how I think about the double nature of habit, I've written about how habituated forms of white privilege and supremacy might be understood to underlie what some people experience as a kind of resurgence or reawakening of really violent and explicit racisms in the context of Trumpism in the US and Brexit in the UK. But on the other hand, establishing new or renewed everyday habits of what the critical race scholar Paul Gilroy calls multicultural conviviality may be vital to the transformational work of anti-racism. I've also written about how technologies of habit are actually really important in various forms of governance, colonial, neo-colonial governments, but also neoliberal and post-neoliberal forms of governing our behavior. And we could think about nudge theory in the US under Obama's administration, and on the other side of the pond too is a key example. These forms of governing behavior can be pernicious or at least paternalistic. They're forms of expert governance that assume that the experts know what is in our best interest and they will subconsciously nudge us into doing it. But at the same time, technologies of habit that actually use similar techniques, but in a different set of conditions and for different ends, also support social movement efforts to connect visions of social justice with the rhythms and routines of everyday life. And I've thought specifically about how Black Lives Matter does this and made some links to the Occupy movement. But let me provide a different kind of example that actually maybe gets at more explicitly the relationships between habit and affect that I've been interested in. So if on the one hand, we have this work in affect theory, but also in popular culture that thinks that in order to get people to actually change, to do something, you need some sort of affective motivation, like a break, a jolt, a revolution of some sort. There's a contrary idea that is much more widespread, I think, and that's the notion of compassion fatigue, both in scholarly work and kind of everyday life. And that idea or trope, as you will know, is that affective responses, if they are prolonged and repeated, will inevitably weaken over time. And that actually using compassion or empathy or anger or other affects as kind of a tool of social justice might be counterproductive. And this is something that Ravison actually kind of anticipates in the 1838 book when he talks about how he understands the differences between repeated sensations on the one hand and repeated actions on the other. So he says prolonged or repeated sensations or feelings diminish gradually and eventually fade away. On the other hand, prolonged or repeated movement becomes easier, quicker, and more assured. So the first time you put a new key into a lock, it's kind of quite hard to turn, but the more times you do it, it actually becomes quicker, smoother, and more efficient, right? That's how he understands habit. He's trying to make a distinction between kind of repeated feeling, which doesn't work in the same way. It becomes less efficient, less powerful. This is really compassion fatigue in a nutshell. But actually, what was interesting to me is upon closer analysis, Ravison's work actually reveals a more complex understanding of the always unfolding processual relationships between affect and habit, in which sustained affect doesn't necessarily lead to desensitization or disaffection. In particular circumstances, he suggests, feeling or sensing can be turned into an activity that can engender a heightening of experience rather than a diminution of feeling. And I think there's parts of Dewey's work that actually make quite a similar or resonant argument. But let me give you the example that Ravison uses to help us think about this, because it's quite an interesting one. He makes a comparison, in his words, between the drunkard and the wine connoisseur. And while the drunkard, in his words, tastes his wine less and less as he continues to drink, the connoisseur develops a refined palate that makes him increasingly discerning. His taste becomes more and more delicate and subtle. So that is, through his attentiveness, the connoisseur transforms the effects of affective repetition so that they intensify rather than diminish the sensorial experience. Right? So this is not just compassion fatigue. This is a kind of sensing that becomes much more active and might have different effects. So if we put aside the classed and gendered and probably racialized implications of his wine connoisseur example, I think that it's actually a significant one because it helps us think about a few points that I think are significant for rethinking social transformation. The first one is that feeling and action might not be as opposed as we often think. One of the ways that I've tried to grapple with this is through the dynamics of what often gets called cancel culture or consequence culture in the US and elsewhere. A lot of the critiques that get made of social media activism as being lazy activism or clicktivism or slacktivism that is simply clicking or sharing and not actually doing the real activity, the work that is necessary for progressive change. And I think there's a lot to those arguments. But at the same time, I think they're bound to kind of a major understanding of social change. And that actually using Ravison's wine connoisseur example helps us think about what we often read as passivity, as just feeling, might be much more than that. There might be more in stake in those forms of networked activism that we often give them credit for. Another point that this example might help us think about is how habituated affect does not inevitably deaden radical political force. And finally, that it might not just be habit or affect in isolation that's important to transformation, but their ongoing interaction. And that in that action, it's the forms of attention or perhaps inattention that we bring into a given situation or set of conditions that might be significant. So in my own work, I've thought about how modes of affective inhabitation, so a kind of sensorial dwelling in a particular context or environment, might actually lead to forms of attentiveness, care, and connection that transform sensing into an activity with a range of political and ethical outcomes. So these are some of the ways in my work that returning to the classic habit philosophies of Dewey, James, and Ravison have helped me conceptualize an ontology of social transformation in which both affect and habit, the revolutionary and the routine, are perpetually intertwined, and that so-called minor gestures and tendencies might be just as significant as what we tend to consider major events. So rather than abandoning the notion of social progress as completely played out or dead, this is an understanding of transformation that sees progress is constantly happening in the present. It's not a far point on the horizon, but as Dewey would say, it's with us here now. And it's about experimentally inhabiting how these gestures, tendencies, affects, and other sorts of relations might be remade or adjusted or imagined or materialized in different ways. But I think what these classical philosophers of habit are not particularly great at, unsurprisingly, is really grappling in a serious way with the relationship between habit and power. Now, I think Dewey is a lot better at this and more interested in this than William James and certainly Ravison. But to varying degrees, these three thinkers tend to understand habituation itself as a neutral mechanism, one that can support a range of biological, social functions and possibilities. But habit itself is not about power per se. It's a mechanism or set of processes. But of course, there's other critical scholars who've explored how embodied and discursive habits are always reproduced through dominant modes of social intelligibility. And that means that they can work in exclusionary and even violent ways. And they certainly work differently for different subjects in different contexts and locations. Now, a key source for me here, but by now, I guess a classic source, is the philosopher Judith Butler in their writing on gender performativity. Butler writes about how attending to the generativity of habit, thinking about new habitual capacities and generative habits, actually needs to always attend to the underside of this, which Butler calls uninhabitability. In her words, the constitution of a domain of unthinkable, abject, and unlivable bodies. So we can think about habits, but what about what becomes uninhabitable? In this case, it's about what if you do not fit into these legible or socially intelligible forms of gender or masculinity or femininity or sexuality or whatever. So in Dewey's liberal version of participatory democracy, which I guess is outlined most extensively in The Public and Its Problems, there's an idea that everybody might be part of this participatory democracy on the basis of being human. But one of the points that Butler's work and other critical scholars make is that to pose the human as an unmarked category is to actually not pay attention to the expectations, in this case, of legible gendered embodiment, which are also intersecting with race and other vectors of social differentiation, which structure the entry into the realm of humanity itself. So the human itself is not separable from power. And obviously, this is a line of thinking we could trace in other forms of critical philosophy and social theory. So there's a long trajectory of radical Black thought. We can draw on Du Bois here, and certainly the contemporary scholarship of someone like Claudia Rankine, who thinks about the experience of Black people and other people of color in the US and elsewhere, about the habituated everyday experience of white privilege and white supremacy, and what that actually means for the capacities that you have to engage in democracy, in the way that Dewey may have imagined. So in thinking about habit in a minor key then, one of my key desires or goals has been to bring these classical philosophical accounts of habit into conversation, not only with affect studies, but also with feminist, queer, anti-racist, and decolonial theory, to produce a speculative pragmatism as a philosophy of transformation. So this is one that, in the spirit of Dewey, is approaching the world speculatively as composed of changing events that, in his words, are moving, fraught with possibilities, and not ever ended or final. But at the same time, it's also one that needs to take seriously the persistence and malleability of habits, particularly those that are linked to changing structures of racism, classism, sexism, ableism, homophobia, all the bad stuff, right? So it's really trying to take seriously, like, how do we think speculatively and experimentally without dropping power out of the picture? But I actually wanted to draw out another element of Dewey's thinking about habit that I think needs to be part of this speculative pragmatism, this approach to thinking about social transformation. In thinking sociologically and perhaps ecologically about habit, it's important to note that Dewey didn't understand habits, or didn't only understand them as individual or personal, or indeed as collective. As some of you have already talked about in your presentations today, he understood them as relational transactions between organisms and environments. And environment for Dewey was conceptualized really broadly, right? So it could be the physiology and biology of the human organism, it could be physical structures and infrastructures, but it could also be cultural and social norms, values, expectations. And I've also thought about how environment can be affective conditions and atmospheres. So from this perspective, habits are never static and they're always more than human. And more than that, habits are always in interaction with and being modified by other habits. So what I found generative about this way of understanding habit is not just kind of acquired modes of responsivity, but it's this more than human idea of like how habit works and how we might intervene in it. So rather than thinking about breaking bad individual or collective habits or indeed forming new ones, we might think about habit assemblages. And habit assemblages might be about mind, body, environment interactions. How do we identify those assemblages, partially map them, and intervene in them in different ways? So to give an example that might make this a bit more tangible, Tony Bennett and colleagues in Australia have thought about how in the context of the climate emergency, and particularly around waste management, the ways that these issues are being approached more inventively is not about changing the subject in terms of habituation or dishabituation or rehabituation, but about intervening in particular assemblages. And part of that might be making changes to the environment and infrastructure that get people to deal with litter in different ways, but also, at higher levels in terms of how we're dealing with carbon and other types of things. Now, in his own work, and particularly in Human Nature and Conduct, Dewey talks about habits as organism-environmental interactions by comparing them to processes, physiological processes. So like processes of respiration and digestion, which require oxygen and food to function, he suggests, habits are not complete within the body. They necessitate the cooperation of an organism and an environment. Now, taking this kind of back to the more cultural, social, and political level, the feminist and critical race philosopher and also pragmatist philosopher Shannon Sullivan argues that actually habits are not just comparable to physiological functions, but rather physiological functions themselves are particular kinds of habits. And I find that quite generative to think about in terms of materiality of habits and how they interact with history and power. So digestion is a transactional habit, Sullivan suggests, not simply because it occurs when the stomach and the intestines have food to process and absorb, but also because it's continually shaped by and materially incorporates wider sociocultural and political relations, including those linked to social privilege and oppression. So, for example, women who have been sexually abused disproportionately suffer from gastrointestinal maladies such as IBS and Crohn's disease. But there's also really interesting and troubling research in epigenetics that suggests that racism can have durable effects on the biological constitution of human beings. And actually, this includes processes of digestion, and this can extend to future generations. So like other habits, digestion is not an unchanging mechanical reflex. It constantly evolves as human psychology and physiology are reshaped by personal and transgenerational experience, as well as wider environmental dynamics and social hierarchies, whether those pertain to industrial farming and food processing practices or kind of ongoing structures of power and oppression. So I mention all of these different examples to try to show kind of a variety of ways in which we might think about how it could be useful to think about habit assemblages as a way to approaching social transformation. In my reading, the logic of assemblage suggests that change at the level of habit is not likely to materialize from targeting either the organism or the environment in isolation. It's not just about changing the individual or the subject or the environment, because actually body and environment, organism and milieu are always entangled, right? So actually then there's this harder question, I think, about how do we target the interfaces and circuits of transmission which connect bodies to their multi-layered milieus, while always recognizing, as I think Dewey consistently reminds us, that such interventions are always subject to unintended consequences. There's no guarantees. So how do we work with habit assemblages while also retaining that speculative and experimental ethos? Now, in all of this, and I guess this is where I try to link in the last part to some of my current research on histories of digital computing and AI, I think that in our contemporary moment, we do need to think a lot more about non-living entities and processes in the working of habit. And I'm thinking particularly here about what might be called algorithmic life, processes of pattern recognition through algorithms and wider developments in artificial intelligence. And if we're thinking about this, it's important to recognize that the forms of corporate governance, surveillance, and extraction that work via habits often, actually rarely do they address human subjects, bodies, and organisms holistically in the way that Dewey often does. they're interested in likes, clicks, shares, your location, but also facial expressions, eye movements, blood pressure, heart rate fluctuations, and all of these things are disaggregated from any individual human body or group and are kind of mixed together in different ways to find trends, across populations, right? So we're not thinking about the individual, but what Gilles Deleuze called the dividual, that is kind of this fragment aggregation of kind of habits, practices, and so forth. So in this way, the geographer Ben Anderson says that we might be in a contemporary condition in which power now operates at the sub or just conscious level of bodily affects. What I think is at stake in our emerging computational world then is not only, as Dewey put it, the unification of human nature and the environment, nature and natural and social, but also a broader and perhaps more complex range of immaterial dynamics in which human and technical processes are actually interpenetrating one another to the point where it becomes more and more difficult to separate human and non-human, human and machine. And the geographer, Louisa Moore, I think puts this quite compellingly when she says that with the rise of machine learning, there's no human outside the algorithm. Humans are lodged within algorithms and algorithms within human. So why am I talking about digital media and AI? And one reason is because I think it's important to conceptualizing what environment actually entails in the current context, that machine learning technologies are becoming environmental in a way I think that past media technologies have not been, but also because I think that they pose considerable challenges for the ongoing salience, efficacy, and critical purchase of Deweyan pragmatism, or what I've called speculative pragmatism. So for Dewey, you've got this kind of embodied subject or experimenter of everyday life, of social change, who's trying to inhabit change as it unfolds, to inhabit a given set of conditions, to really be able to feel change as it's happening, and therefore get at those minor currents that are kind of happening underneath everyday life that actually might be materialized otherwise, that might take shape in different ways. But what we have with the digital and machine learning technologies that are coming into order so many parts of our social world, whether through search engines or consumption or border policing or carceral politics, is technologies that we're not often aware of. And even if we are, we don't know how they work. The mechanisms that they use to make decisions and to have outcomes are not ones that map onto any human capacity like sensing or perception or decision making. And even the engineers and computer scientists that design neural net algorithms don't necessarily know all the ways that they work either, because they are black box and they're not subject to kind of explainability and understanding. So I think there's a question here of whether our current techno-social conditions in relation to our socio-political conditions are pretending a future reality in which we as humans become ever more alienated from the very processes that are mediating our everyday habits, gestures, feelings, and sensorial ways of being in the world. Now, my view is that this need not be the case. This doesn't have to be a situation of alienation or perhaps becoming more cynical, as we were talking about in the last panel. But it does, I think, suggest that we need to do some rethinking about how we understand agency and how that might be part of this question we have about the ongoing salience and possibilities of Deweyan pragmatism and other forms of pragmatist thinking. What I think it enables us to grapple with is the reality of distributed agency. So thinking through the lens of habit assemblages gets us to think about a range of capacities for what Dewey calls intelligent action. And these are made possible not by a kind of disembodied capacity for rational thought, but rather by evolving interactions between mind, body, environment. But I think what's really important in the current context is what we even mean by mind, body, and environment may be radically changing. So for example, we can think about the rise of generative AI and large language models like ChatGPT 3 and 4 and probably 5. Like, are they thinking? Are they different kinds of minds? What type of thought is this? what even constitutes a kind of body or environment in our current domain. And maybe we can't hold on to the same understanding of those categories as before. And more than this, maybe we need to keep thinking about these concepts like will and deliberation, and that the kinds of social change through habit that we might be interested in are ones that might unfold through broader processes of consciousness or less than consciousness and non-consciousness and attention as well as inattention. And we're thinking about assemblages where that is the case, but also where there's non-human actors that might exert their own forms of agency. So there's a range of, I think, complex questions that we are grappling with in the contemporary movement. So I'm going to wrap up now and say that in my conclusion, I've raised a lot of questions, more than I've provided any answers or solutions. I hope that's in the spirit of a kind of Deweyan approach to things. But basically, I've tried to argue that approaching social change through the logics of habit, or maybe habit-affect interactions, is about more than addressing habituation's powerful role in reproducing existing patterns and injustices. It's also about exploring how new or renewed tendencies are crucial to transformation that actually makes a difference. Transformation that endures, but actually changes things in an important way. So composing social change in a minor key is concerned then with how we can imaginatively and experimentally re-inhabit existing cultural, social, economic, political, and technological relations to generate novel forms of relationality, cooperation, and life living in ways that don't simply roll out what Dewey calls preset formulas or old moral truths. And I'll end there. Thank you.
We'll take a few minutes for some questions and comments and then move on to our reception and continue the conversation with Carolyn and among us. I see a hand in the back. Go. Please introduce yourself.
I wonder if you could explain what way this concept of habit is power beyond. I didn't get that, because I thought the whole point with habit was to think of the way in which philosophy has been intellectualist in a society that is dominated, which is a society of class domination. You repeatedly telling the story of we've never seen a democratic society. We've gone from a slave society to a capitalist society, and here. And this is a society that makes us blind to habit. So it seems to me that the concept of habit, it's constitutively tied to the society that is a society of domination. So I'm wondering what sense is concept around habit is power blind.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I don't think that it is power blind. I think that Dewey's work has lots of tools for understanding habits as always situated in structural relations and relationships of power. But I think the genealogy of habit as a concept has lots of examples where it's not even just that power isn't considered, but habit is being thought about philosophically in terms of how to control and manage people. So in Felix Ravisson's work that I talked about, he talks about habit as involving both addiction and grace. So addiction is this automated repetition, and grace is this ease kind of force and capacity. But when he talks about grace, he's also talking about how actually all of this is happening kind of because of God's will, and like we have a certain level of agency, but it's a very theological argument. It's kind of about how to use habit to practice what Foucault would later call pastoral power, right? So when I'm saying that habit has not always engaged directly in confronting kind of the role of habituation in modes of regulation, surveillance, and control, I'm partially thinking about how often habit has been used not to create, expansive capacities, but really as forms of governance that have been quite violent. And I think, Dewey is trying to grapple with those histories, trying to offer and open up different ways of thinking about habit in much more progressive ways, to use his terms. But I don't think that in his work, and maybe it's not fair to think that he would have in the context he's writing, that he really confronts kind of this idea of uninhabitability and this idea of kind of like, how is the human actually always constructed within structures of power that really play a role in figuring what types of habitual capacities by who can be constructed in what given conditions. And that's where I felt like I've had to go to radical Black thought. I've had to go to feminist and queer thinking. I've had to go to decolonial studies to really confront, the relationship between habit and power.
We're going to hold for the microphone here since we're live streaming. Josh?
Hi there, I'm Josh Forstender for the University of Sheffield, not too far from you. Thank you so much for your talk. I found it very interesting, and you wedded together a number of different authors and traditions in a manner I had never come across. My question for you is let's call it an in-house question, but it's one that really troubles me. And it's in response to what's up on the board there, composing social change in a minor key. It's a traditional critique of Dewey and of liberals who saw themselves as Deweyan liberals, that they somehow engage too much in the romance of the everyday form of change and insufficiently in the romance of the event. I mean, for what it's worth, George Novak famously thought that Dewey was, and pragmatists like him, were equivalent to squids when it came to matters of principles compared with a good communist. And so my point to you is a really simple one that I just would like to know what you think about, is that for all of the things you brought together, in the end, one wonders, what is the practical consequence of being a Deweyan in this age if we face a moment in which there is a possibility of leverage that's so profound in the AI space and probably automation of physical objects that go with it? Are we really just losing the possibility of that romance of the everyday in the face of just a lever that is so significant that we better have an event?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not an easy question. Yeah, I mean, my view would be that Deweyan pragmatism has the capacity to be critical, and in my thing at least, it's one important vector in how to conceptualize the present and the possibility of changing that, but it's not the only one, and it can't stand alone. And I think we need different strands of theory and practice to go alongside Dewey to rethink and remake, Deweyan thought itself for the contemporary moment. And I mean, I guess, the everyday, what I do take from Dewey, but also affect theory and some of the other resources I draw on, is that the evental and the everyday are always interlinked. And sometimes when we are looking at different practices of the everyday, that's the only way that we can access the event, right? So it's not throwing away the revolutionary, the evental, the radical, what Sedgwick called paranoid critique. We need all that. Like, those are important and vital tools in the kind of landscape of praxis that we have available to us. But it's kind of like, how do we use those tools and what conditions? And like, those don't happen outside of the everyday. So it's about, for me, it's about seeing the revolutionary in the routine, the evental in the everyday as the access points through which we can actually engage in urgent, at this point, forms of action. But that's a question I will keep thinking about.
Others? Yes, Katerina, can you come to Terry?
Hi, thank you for your talk, Terry Wilson, University of Colorado in Boulder. And I wanted to ask a curiosity question about the title and the use of the term speculative, which I think is, appearing in many different venues and genres and fields, including my own. But I was just wondering I guess there's multiple questions here, but what speculatism or speculative as a modifier offers pragmatism? And you also connect the term speculative and experimental. And I wondered about how those terms might be different or synonymous. And then you raised this really interesting question about how do we focus on the speculative and the experimental without losing power, but how do you see that happening? Or does experimental give you some tools for answering that? And speculative, how do those terms differently grapple with power?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, some also really good and I think difficult questions. When I first kind of arrived at this term speculative pragmatism, I thought that I had coined it myself. You know, you have those moments where you think you're like, and then you realize there's a long history. And so I mean, one more recent place that was being used is speculative pragmatism gets used by Aaron Manning, the philosopher I mentioned earlier, but also Brian Masumi, who has been a key thinker in affect theory. So for Masumi, he says that to think pragmatically is about asking how do things work, and to think speculatively is to ask, well, now that we know how things work in this given moment or kind of situation, what does that then mean for the categories and concepts we use to animate our critical thinking? How might they need to change? And that's kind of the speculative part for him. And, you know, I'm taking that to think speculatively in a society which itself is perhaps becoming more speculative, whether that's through practices of financial trading or the kind of algorithmic forms of governance or kind of media, you know, resonance that is kind of making changes at the level of affect. I think, you know, adding speculative as a modifier to pragmatism for Dewey is a little bit redundant because, you know, I've tried to think about how it is already speculative, experimental, and so forth. I guess, you know, what somebody like Masumi or some of the work in affect theory or new materialism or other fields might add to that term speculative is really that rethinking of some of the foundational categories that Dewey or other pragmatists of his time were using. So I spoke about kind of mind, body, and environment, or kind of the cooperation of an organism and environment, or humans and social milieus. But these very categories of environment, human, mind, body, I think are being in some cases quite radically remade. So to think speculatively in that context is really to push beyond the assumptions quite deeply embedded that we have of like what these concepts are, and to really be speculative, but also realistic about what they might mean today. I don't know about I'd have to think more about speculative versus experimental, because that's a good question.
Up here. Katerina, come to Randy. I'll have to hand that down.
Thanks for your talk. It's really great. I'm Randy Oxher from SIU Carbondale. Something has always bothered me about Dewey, and a number of Dewey scholars have addressed this at various points, but there is in Edith Stein's work on empathy, which that's where she talks about how there's this moment in us that is wholly receptive to the sort of, it's sensation, but it's far more than sensation, the experience of the other. And then there's this part of us, which is still part of our subjectivity, which resists objectifying ourselves in order to do something about this experience of this empathic experience. I find that Dewey is tone deaf to the self-resistance, which is to say, so habit is a self-objectification. When we try to form a new habit, Edith Stein would say, we have to impersonalize ourselves. We have to move away from what makes us person and become kind of more a part of the organic whole. And of course, there's a loss of subjectivity that's involved in there, but a key moment in empathy is always the moment when we resist that very move. And so it's in my resistance of forming a habit that I sort of complete my empathic experience of somebody else. And Dewey just doesn't have this moment. He's not very good phenomenologically, is part of what I'm saying. Lots of good phenomenologists have talked about Dewey and compared him with Merleau-Ponty and others. But there's this moment of resistance to self-objectification that Stein talks about really deeply, but other phenomenologists do as well. I just wonder what you would say about, you know, how do you add the resistance to impersonalizing ourselves to your story?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, one thing it makes me think about is how in Ravisson's work, he talks about how making or remaking habits require this interplay between what he calls receptivity and resistance. So you need to be open, you need to be receptive to change in a given environment in order for anything to be shaken up. But you can't be so open and so receptive that like it just goes into mush or it becomes kind of, so there's this element of resistance that's necessary. Now, he's not talking about it in the way that you are or that Stein was, but at least it's kind of a mapping of that interplay that I think is important. And you're right, I don't think it comes out in the same way in Dewey's work. The other thing it makes me think about is that Human in Nature and Conduct, when it's published in 1922, does seem to be in some ways speaking back to or against kind of psychoanalysis kind of in that time. And you know, one of Dewey's problems, I think, with psychoanalysis is that it assumes that change can happen just by talking to people and these kind of discursive or linguistic moves. He doesn't think it really gets at the body and the phenomenological issues you're talking about. But he's also critical of kind of physiology that assumes that you can just go right at the body and address a lesion or whatever. And so he arrives at this social psychology via habit, but it's not a very psychoanalytically informed one. And it's not one that grapples, I think, as well as it could do with resistance, with ambivalence, with the messiness of why people repeat behaviors or actions that may not be in their best interest, why trauma might compel us to repeat the site of the wound or the injury again and again to try to master it without us ever knowing that. And I mean, in my work, I've tried to think more about resistance and ambivalence to actually get at like why change is hard and why it's messy and why sometimes we might learn more from failures than from what we might see as successes, or that we might need a different angle to think about how that's happening. So I don't think that answers your question, but at least kind of raises some issues that it made me think.
What's behind that question?
Yeah.
Because I have a hard time understanding folks who just go back over and over and do things that they don't like the results of. But having been addicted to cigarettes at one time myself, I sort of get this. But at some level, I think Dewey just doesn't.
Yeah.
It's like the man, well, he was addicted to cigarettes, but your wine example, which I'm sure we all enjoyed, right? It's like, I'm not sure where that line is between refining my taste by active sensation and having a little too much.
Yeah, I think he needs a understanding of bad habits that, and I mean, he does problematize that, but I don't think he gets at the real psychic, social kind of interplay that, like, you know, like why with my sleeplessness, the pharmaceutical aids kind of came in. It's not that you think that's a good idea. It's not that you don't know that being able to stop that would be better for you. It's that you are so desperate to sleep and believe that you may never sleep again, that you're compelled to kind of engage in a repetition that Dewey would call, you know, a bad habit.
Okay, let's pick up Luis, and then that will probably be our last question.
Don't mind if anyone.
No, yeah.
Thanks. I'm Luis Villacañas from the University of Valencia in Spain. Thanks for your incredible talk. Really, I'm extremely impressed. It makes me think really intensely. Now, thinking back about Dewey's The Public and Its Problems, 1927, reading it, already then, I think that Dewey saw that the possibility of actually actualizing democratic publics was precarious. It was difficult even then, with the state of technology then. Now, reading listening to your explanation about how the new technologies capture already habits, capture physiological realities, I don't see how from that technological landscape, which is, of course, intensifies a lot the indirect consequences that we all suffer. I don't see how from that one can follow any emancipatory potential. That's the problem that I see. Okay, I don't see one thing follow from the other hand, because once technology captures habits and our own physiology, what else is there left for us? There's no community either, unless you can connect all these habits with building communities, etc., which already Dewey found hard then. I really just don't see it. I'm much more pessimistic.
Yeah, I think this is the dominant affect in critical data studies, digital media studies, and which kind of some of my other work fits into. I mean, it's just like, but what I see kind of in that field, especially say on Twitter or Blue Sky or whatever, is this. So the way we're trying to deal with that, or people are trying to deal with it, is this kind of what Sedgwick would call paranoid critique, just consistently pointing out everything that is bad and terrifying and dangerous about big tech and kind of these platforms, which is like vitally necessary, obviously, given their power and their capacity to create this environment that is nudging us at these subconscious affective levels all the time, reaching further into the body, you know, to orchestrate change before it even happens. But I guess one of the things I find depressing, or just like not capacity forming from that, is that we then kind of don't have imagination. We don't have that thinking otherwise. And the deck is stacked, you know, very powerfully against that. But I was thinking there was a line in the last panel, Kathleen, where you were talking about when everything's so bad, when kind of cynicism about democracy feels so overwhelming, like what happens when we actually make a strategic choice to look at these projects of creative democracy that are happening that might seem minor, and you know, what possibilities are inherent in that. And I think, you know, that's part of what I've been trying to do in that work, like kind of data justice collectives and, you know, participatory data banks, but also like going back in the history of digital computing and AI and seeing all these possibilities that were inherent in the present of how it could have been otherwise. It could have been more cooperative. It could have been more bottom up. It didn't happen, but those histories aren't necessarily lost. And like, what happens if we look at those roads not taken and actually fabulate or kind of imagine what different realities could come from them, and like what capacity do we have to make elements of those today?
I say we stop on that note. Professor Luis, where are we going? Right outside. Okay, we're going outside.
The way out.
On the way out, that way, not right here, outside. Okay. Yes. Okay.